It always rained in Ashwood in late October. Not the kind of rain that made you want to curl up in front of a fireplace, but the kind that lingered, soaking streets, dampening the air, and clinging to your skin like a warning you didn't understand. The town was small, barely a speck on the map of Maine, tucked between old forests and abandoned rail tracks. To outsiders, it looked charming in that faded, postcard way. But to the people who lived there, it carried secrets no one dared whisper after dark. Emma Grayson had lived in Ashwood all her 32 years. She taught 3rd grade at the only elementary school in town, and on nights like these, she often lingered in her classroom, grading papers while the rain tapped against the tall, grimy windows. She liked the sound of it, usually. Tonight, though, there was something different. A strange rhythm. A pattern. She looked up from her desk and frowned. The rain was falling hard, but underneath it, there was a lighter sound. A faint tapping, as though someone were bouncing something against the glass. Emma rose and stepped toward the window, brushing back a strand of damp blonde hair. And that's when she saw it. Floating in the street lamp's glow outside was a balloon. Bright, crimson-red, bobbing gently in the storm. It didn't sway the way a normal balloon would. It moved against the wind, tugging itself closer to the schoolyard gate, then hovering there, waiting. Emma's chest tightened. Balloons weren't unusual, but in this weather? And with no child or parent nearby. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, forcing a laugh at her nerves. Just trash, she thought. Probably caught on something. Still, when she turned off the lights and locked her classroom door, she couldn't help glancing back out into the rain. The balloon was gone. Across town, Sheriff Mark Reynolds was finishing his nightly patrol. Mark was 40, tired-looking, with the kind of face that had seen too many bar fights and not enough sleep. He knew every corner of Ashwood, every crack in its sidewalks. Which was why, when he drove past Elm Street and noticed a small group of kids standing in the downpour, staring at something, he pulled over immediately. "Hey!" he barked, stepping out of his cruiser. "What are you doing out here? Get home before you catch pneumonia." The kids didn't move. Their wide eyes were fixed on the same point in the street. Mark followed their gaze and froze. A single red balloon floated a few feet above the pavement. He squinted through the rain. "Whose is that?" he demanded, but the kids just looked at him in silence. One of them, a boy with freckles, whispered, "It was Tommy's." Mark's stomach dropped. "Where's Tommy?" The boy pointed. He went with it." "What do you mean, he went with it?" Mark stepped closer, heart hammering. But the balloon rose higher into the storm, twisting down the street as if it had chosen a direction, and vanished into the mist. Tommy's small yellow raincoat lay crumpled on the wet asphalt. By morning, the whole town knew. Word spread fast in Ashwood, especially when it involved children. Tommy Hayes, 7 years old, had vanished into thin air. His mother was inconsolable, screaming at the deputies that night until her throat bled. His father sat on the porch with his face in his hands, rain dripping through his hair as if he hadn't even noticed. Emma arrived at school to find the hallways buzzing. Whispers. Fear. Parents pulling their kids out early. By the time she got to her classroom, only half her students were there. She tried to go about the day as if nothing had changed, but the empty chair at the back of the room, Tommy's chair, made her throat ache. At recess, she overheard 2 kids whispering near the window. "My cousin saw it too," one girl said. "The red balloon." "Don't say that," another boy hissed. "If you say it, it comes for you." Emma's skin prickled. She wanted to scold them, tell them not to spread rumors, but the words caught in her throat. Because deep down, she had seen it too. That night, Ashwood gathered in the town hall. The storm still raged outside, rattling the windows, while the mayor, a frail man with liver spots on his hands, tried to assure everyone that Tommy would be found. Sheriff Mark stood at the front, jaw tight, eyes haunted. He spoke little, because he knew there was little to say. They had combed the woods, the streets, the abandoned rail station. No trace. No footprints. Nothing but the balloon. When the meeting broke, Emma approached Mark. "I saw it," she blurted before she could stop herself. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "The balloon. Last night. Outside the school." His eyes darkened. "Emma, don't spread this." People are already losing their minds. Balloons don't take children. People do. But as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. 2 nights later, it happened again. Chloe Parker, age 9, vanished from her own bedroom. Her mother swore she tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and left her sleeping. In the morning, Chloe's bed was empty. The only thing left was a red balloon, hovering inches from the ceiling. Mark popped it with his knife. A sharp hiss of air escaped, but the balloon was filled with something thicker than air. A red mist seeped into the room, staining the wallpaper as it dissipated. Chloe was never found. By the end of the week, Ashwood was unraveling. Parents locked their doors, taped their windows, slept beside their children with knives under pillows. But the balloons kept appearing. Sometimes in the middle of the street, sometimes tied to fences. Once, a whole cluster of them bobbed outside the diner, red as fresh blood against the gray sky. Emma couldn't sleep. Each night, she heard faint laughter in the rain, high-pitched, childlike, echoing down the empty streets. Sometimes, she swore she heard Tommy's voice calling for help. Sometimes she thought she saw small shapes moving in the mist, little hands reaching. And always, the red balloon floated just beyond reach. Waiting. The rain didn't stop. By the time the second week of October came, Ashwood had become a town of locked doors, shuttered windows, and sleepless nights. The storm clung to the town like a curse. Power lines flickered, basements flooded, and yet the townsfolk whispered that the weather wasn't what terrified them most. It was the balloons. Each morning, someone found one, tied to a lamppost, drifting outside a second-story window, hovering over the playground swing sets, their scarlet reflections rippling across the puddles below. And each time a balloon appeared, a child disappeared. On a Wednesday night, twins Matthew and Claire Redding vanished from their home. Their parents found the bedroom window wide open, curtains fluttering with rain, and 2 small red balloons pressed against the ceiling. The sheriff's deputies tore through the house with flashlights, searching for footprints in the mud. But there were none. Only wet handprints, small, child-sized, smeared across the walls, leading nowhere. Emma sat up late that night, hands shaking around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from parents pulling their kids from school, demanding answers, threatening to leave Ashwood altogether. But how could she answer? She had no answers. Only images that haunted her, the first balloon in the schoolyard, Tommy's raincoat, Chloe's empty bed. And the laughter she still heard sometimes in the patter of rain against her roof. It was always faint, like the sound of children playing far away. Only now, when she listened closely, she swore she could make out words. Whispers. Calling names. Emma! The sheriff's office was drowning in chaos. Mark Reynolds hadn't slept in 3 days. His deputies filed reports that sounded like fever dreams, balloons that moved on their own, shapes glimpsed in the rain, shadows of children darting across the flooded streets. At dawn, Mark stood outside the Redding house, staring at the 2 balloons in his hand. He had tied them together, afraid to let them drift free. He thought maybe they were evidence. Maybe they had fingerprints, fibers, something. But when he carried them inside, the balloons pulsed under his grip, as if beating with tiny hearts. He nearly dropped them in horror. "Sheriff," one of his deputies asked, pale as death, "what should we tell the town?" Mark looked down at the balloons, then back at the storm outside. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Tell them the truth," he said. "We're not dealing with a person. We're dealing with something else." By Friday, 5 children were gone. By Saturday, it was 9. Ashwood had turned into a ghost town. The diner closed. The church stood empty. Only the hardware store remained open, selling locks, boards, and chains to frantic parents. The streets, once alive with children biking and playing, were silent now, except for the occasional squeak of rubber against wet pavement when a balloon drifted by. And then came Sunday night. Emma was driving home from the school when she saw them. A cluster of balloons, a dozen at least, floating over the bridge at the edge of town. They glowed crimson in the storm, tethered to the railings by strings that writhed like veins. Her car stalled. The engine just died. She sat gripping the wheel, unable to breathe, as the balloons tugged against their strings like they were alive. And then she saw what hung below them. Small shoes. soaking wet, dangling above the water. Emma screamed and slammed the door open, stumbling into the rain. The shoes swung back and forth in the storm. But when she blinked, they were gone. Only the balloons remained. And as they began to drift toward her, she scrambled back into her car, turned the ignition again and again until it finally roared to life, and tore down the street without looking back. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her small house, staring at the rain-slicked street outside. And then, just past midnight, she saw them. Children. Dozens of them. Their pale faces peered through the mist, their hair plastered to their skulls with rainwater. Their eyes glowed faintly, like lanterns in the dark. They stood in the middle of the street, unmoving, watching her house. Emma's hand shook as she pulled the curtain closed. But when she peeked again, they were gone. Only a single red balloon hovered outside her gate. She did not sleep at all. By now, Sheriff Mark was desperate. He pored over town records, digging into Ashwood's past. He learned that this wasn't the first time children had vanished. It had happened in 1968. And before that, in 1923. And before that, in 1881. Always in October. Always during the rains. Always marked by red balloons. No one ever found the children. They simply became whispers, ghost stories passed down to keep other kids in line. But the cycle always returned. Mark called an emergency meeting in the church basement. Barely a dozen people showed. Most families had already fled Ashwood. Emma was there, pale and silent in the back row. Mark unrolled the old newspapers he had found. The black and white photos showed parents from decades ago, weeping, holding up pictures of their missing children. And in the corner of one photograph, nearly hidden in shadow, was a balloon. Red, even in the faded print. "This thing has been here longer than us," Mark said, voice shaking. "It comes with the storms. It takes what it wants. And if we don't find a way to stop it, there won't be any children left in Ashwood." Someone in the crowd sobbed. Another shouted, "Then how do we stop it?" Mark didn't answer. Because he didn't know. 2 nights later, Emma woke to a sound. Not rain. Not thunder. Something else. Music. It was faint, carried through the storm, the sound of a child's music box, its tinny notes winding through the night. She followed it to her front porch, where a small wooden box sat on the steps. Her blood turned cold. She hadn't owned a music box since she was a little girl. She knelt, hands trembling, and opened the lid. Inside was a balloon. Deflated, wrinkled, but unmistakably red. And wrapped around it, tied like ribbon, was something worse. A bracelet. Pink, plastic, with beads that spelled out a name, Chloe. Emma dropped the box and screamed. That same night, another child vanished. Then another. And then, all at once, the storm intensified. The rain fell harder, the thunder louder, the wind like a living thing ripping through the trees. The balloons multiplied. Hundreds of them now, filling the sky over Ashwood like an army. Their strings dangled low, brushing rooftops, curling against doors, tapping on windows like skeletal fingers. The town was suffocating. The air smelled of damp earth and iron. Emma huddled inside her house, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. But she knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter how tightly she locked her doors. The balloons weren't outside anymore. They were already inside. The storm reached its peak. By the final week of October, Ashwood was no longer a town. It was a wound. Houses stood empty, streets deserted, storefronts broken and abandoned. The people who could escape were gone, and the ones who stayed lived like prisoners, whispering prayers behind locked doors. But the balloons never stopped coming. On the 29th, Sheriff Mark stood at the edge of Main Street and counted them. They filled the sky like blood cells in a vein, drifting, swelling, pressing against one another until the whole horizon was red. Their strings dragged along rooftops and power lines, brushing the wet pavement as though searching for something or someone. When the wind shifted, Mark swore he heard them whispering. Not the balloons themselves, but the children. Dozens of voices carried in the storm, calling out, playful and eerie all at once. "Come out and play. Don't hide. We see you. Emma!" Always Emma. Inside her house, Emma sat curled in the corner of her living room, clutching the pink bracelet that once belonged to Chloe. Her eyes were raw from crying, her body weak from exhaustion. She hadn't eaten in days. Every shadow in the room seemed to move when she blinked, every creak of the wood sounded like a child's footstep. She thought she'd gone mad until the knocking began. It wasn't loud. Just soft, rhythmic, like knuckles tapping glass. She followed the sound with dread, her bare feet padding across the floor. It came from the kitchen window. When she pulled back the curtain, her heart nearly stopped. A child stood outside in the rain. A little boy, no older than 6. His clothes clung to his skin, soaked through, and his lips were blue. He stared at her through the glass with wide, lifeless eyes. In his hand, he clutched a balloon. Red. Always red. The boy tilted his head, his mouth moving soundlessly. Then he lifted his free hand and pressed it against the window. His palm left a wet imprint on the glass, small and trembling. Emma stumbled back. But the boy didn't move. He only kept staring, his lips still shaping words she couldn't hear. And then, impossibly, another child stepped into view. A girl this time, her hair matted with rain, her dress clinging to her thin frame. She held a balloon too. Behind her came another. And another. Until half a dozen children pressed their faces and hands against the window, silent, dripping, their eyes locked on Emma. Her scream tore through the storm. When she turned and fled, the glass shattered behind her. Sheriff Mark heard it. He was only a few blocks away, walking the empty streets with his shotgun slung over his shoulder, when Emma's scream cut through the thunder. He ran, boots slapping through puddles, and saw her front door burst open. Emma stumbled out, barefoot, her face pale with terror. "They're here," she gasped. "The children, they're inside." Mark raised his weapon, but the sight that met him drained the strength from his arms. The children stepped out of Emma's house one by one, filing into the rain. They moved strangely, like puppets tugged on invisible strings, their limbs jerking in unnatural rhythms. Each held a balloon. Their faces were blank, drained of life, but their eyes glowed faintly, pulsing with some inner light. Mark lifted the shotgun and fired. The blast tore through one of the balloons, but instead of popping, it burst like flesh. A spray of thick, black liquid splattered across the street. The balloon twisted in the air, then knit itself back together, whole again. The children laughed. High-pitched, overlapping, the sound cut through Mark's bones. The townsfolk who remained gathered in the church that night. Barely 20 of them, huddled in the candlelit basement, clutching crosses and whispering prayers. Mark and Emma stumbled in, drenched and shaken, telling them what they'd seen. But even underground, there was no safety. The balloon scraped against the stained-glass windows above, dozens of them pressing against the walls of the church, their red glow bleeding into the candlelight. The floor trembled. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and iron. And then came the sound. Children's voices, chanting in unison. A song, broken and discordant, but unmistakably a nursery rhyme. "Ring around the rosy. Pocket full of posies." The townsfolk covered their ears. Some sobbed. Others screamed. "Ashes, ashes." The candles blew out. "We all fall." Darkness swallowed the basement. When Emma opened her eyes again, she wasn't in the church anymore. She was standing in the middle of the old Ashwood playground. The storm was gone. The air was still. The ground was dry. And around her, the children stood in a wide circle. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Their pale faces watched her silently, each one clutching a balloon that swayed without wind. Emma spun in panic. The church was gone. The town was gone. Only the playground remained, trapped in some endless night. At the center of the circle, a figure emerged. Taller than the children, but bent, its spine crooked, its limbs long and wrong. It wore no face, only a smooth expanse of pale skin. Balloons sprouted from its back like wings, their strings writhing and curling in the dirt. Emma's voice broke as she whispered, "What are you?" The faceless figure tilted its head. And in the voices of every missing child, it answered, "We are Play." The children giggled. The balloons strained against their strings, pulsing, swelling like living organs. Emma fell to her knees, clutching Chloe's bracelet, sobbing, "Please, give them back. Give her back." The faceless figure crouched, lowering its smooth, featureless head until it was inches from hers. A seam split across its face, peeling into a mouth that stretched far too wide. Inside, there was no tongue, no teeth, only endless red string, unspooling into the dirt like veins. It whispered again, this time only for her. "She is not yours anymore." Sheriff Mark found her. Or at least, he thought he did. He opened his eyes in the church basement, but Emma was gone. Only the townsfolk remained, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. When he staggered outside into the storm, he saw her across the street. She stood barefoot in the rain, clutching a red balloon. Her eyes glowed faintly, just like the children's. "Emma," Mark whispered. She smiled at him. A hollow, empty smile. Then she let the balloon go. It floated upward, joining the thousands above until the sky was nothing but red. And in that moment, Sheriff Mark understood. The storm would pass. The balloons would vanish. But not all of them. Some would linger, tucked away in corners, drifting into new towns, waiting. And when the rains came again, the children would follow. Ashwood wasn't cursed. The world was. The next morning, the storm was gone. The sky was blue. The streets were quiet. Ashwood was empty. On the playground, a single balloon drifted lazily, its string tangled around the swing set. It bobbed gently in the breeze, waiting for the next child to find it. Waiting for playtime to begin again.